The main topic of this story is family betrayal and favoritism, and my name is Emily Carter, the daughter telling it, and the moment that changed everything began with my father standing so close to me I could smell the bitterness of coffee on his breath as he said, "You will sign these papers today," and when I laughed, just a small disbelieving sound, his hand came out of nowhere and struck my face so hard my vision blurred. My mother gasped but didn't move. My sister Rachel let out a sharp inhale that sounded almost like excitement, and I tasted blood as my father added, cold and final, "That penthouse belongs to your sister now." And in those first few seconds before the sting even faded, I understood that this wasn't an argument, it was an execution, because they had already decided my role, and it was to give up what I had built and thank them for the privilege. We were standing in my penthouse overlooking the Chicago River, sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out beneath us like proof of every sacrifice I had made, and the irony of being slapped in a home I alone paid for wasn't lost on me. But what hurt more was how natural it all felt to them, how practiced, like this scene had been rehearsed long before I walked into the room. And as I pressed my tongue against my teeth to make sure none were loose, my mother finally spoke, her voice tight with disappointment rather than concern, saying, "Emily, don't make this harder than it needs to be," while Rachel crossed her arms and avoided my eyes, already acting like the victim. And I remember thinking how strange it was that no one asked if I was okay, not after the slap, not after the demand, not after the years it took to get here, and instead they all just waited, confident I would fall back into line the way I always had. I had invited them over that afternoon thinking it would be a short visit, maybe coffee, maybe polite conversation, because despite everything, some part of me still believed in normalcy, still believed that family gatherings didn't come with legal documents hidden inside leather folders. But my father hadn't even sat down before placing the folder on my dining table like a weapon, explaining that Rachel needed stability, that she had been through so much, that family supports family, and when I asked why that support always seemed to flow in one direction, my mother sighed deeply and said, "You're the strong daughter," as if that explained everything, as if strength meant endless surrender. And when I told them calmly that I wasn't giving away my home, not now, not ever, the temperature in the room dropped, and the conversation turned sharp and ugly in a matter of seconds. Rachel finally spoke then, her voice trembling in that familiar way that always summoned protection, saying, "I knew you'd do this, you've always thought you were better than me." And before I could respond, my father exploded, accusing me of selfishness, of greed, of forgetting where I came from, even though I remembered every cramped apartment, every student loan statement, every night I cried alone because asking for help felt pointless, and when I reminded him that I bought the penthouse myself, that no one helped me, his face hardened, and that's when his hand struck me, and the sound echoed in the room louder than I would have expected, followed by silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. And I realized that in their minds my success was never mine, it was something they felt entitled to redistribute. As I stood there, stunned, memories flooded me all at once, not as a neat timeline but as flashes. Rachel crying at age 7 while my parents rushed to comfort her as I stood forgotten in the doorway. Teenage Rachel wrecking my car and being told it was an accident while I was told to be more careful next time. College acceptance letters I opened alone, promotions I celebrated quietly, and the constant refrain that followed me through every stage of my life. "You can handle it," a sentence that sounded supportive but really meant "we won't protect you." And I saw then how perfectly this moment fit into that pattern, how inevitable it really was. My mother finally moved, but not toward me, toward the papers, sliding them closer across the table and saying, "Just sign, Emily, you don't even need all this space, you're alone anyway." And that sentence cut deeper than the slap, because it reduced my entire life to a flaw, turned independence into a failure. And Rachel looked up at me then with something like relief, like she believed this was already over, like the penthouse was hers and I just hadn't caught up yet. And I thought about the nights I stayed late at work while she moved back home again, the rent I quietly paid for her apartments, the excuses I made for her choices, and for the first time instead of anger I felt clarity. I picked up the folder and flipped through the papers slowly, my hand steady despite the pounding in my ears, recognizing legal language, transfer clauses, assumptions so bold they bordered on delusion. And when I looked back up and said, "You don't own this place," my father scoffed and replied, "We're your parents, of course we do." And in that moment I understood how deep the entitlement ran, how little my boundaries had ever mattered. And when I set the folder back down untouched and said, "No," the room erupted again, accusations flying, voices rising, my mother crying now but still not apologizing, Rachel pacing like she was the one being wronged, And I realized that nothing I said would change their narrative, because in it I was never the injured party, only the obstacle. So I did something unexpected. I grabbed my purse, not dramatically, not in tears but calmly, and as I headed for the door, my father shouted after me that I was tearing the family apart, that I would regret this, that I thought money made me better than them, and I turned back just once and said quietly, "You already chose." And when the elevator doors closed behind me, my legs finally gave way and I leaned against the wall, my cheek throbbing, my heart racing. The reality of what had just happened settling in slowly and painfully, because the slap wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It was the clearest confirmation I had ever received that love in my family came with conditions, and I had finally refused to meet them. That night, alone in my penthouse, ice pressed against my face, city lights flickering below, I replayed the scene over and over, not because I wanted to dwell in pain, but because something inside me was changing, hardening into resolve, and for the first time in my life I didn't ask myself how to fix it, how to smooth things over, how to make it easier for them. Instead I asked a different question, one that felt dangerous and liberating all at once. For as long as I could remember, my family had been a quiet hierarchy disguised as love, and Rachel sat comfortably at the top while I learned to survive somewhere beneath it, because even as children the rules were unspoken but absolute. Her tears carried weight while mine were treated like inconveniences, and my parents never said they loved her more. They didn't have to. It showed in the way the house shifted around her moods, the way plans changed when she was tired, the way excuses were manufactured for her failures while expectations piled endlessly on my shoulders, and I grew up believing that fairness was something other families talked about, not something we practiced, because in ours fairness meant giving Rachel what she needed and trusting that I would cope without anything at all. When I was 10 and she was 8, she broke my favorite necklace while playing with it without asking, and when I cried my mother knelt in front of me and said, "She didn't mean it, you know how sensitive she is," and then turned to Rachel and hugged her when she started crying too. And I remember standing there confused, wondering when my sadness had become less important than her guilt, and moments like that stacked up over the years until they formed the foundation of our family dynamic. One where I learned early that being agreeable was safer than being honest. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us widened, but instead of addressing it, my parents leaned into it, treating Rachel like fragile glass and me like reinforced steel, and when she skipped classes or failed exams, the conversations were soft and understanding, full of concern about stress and pressure, but when I brought home perfect grades, the praise was brief and quickly followed by reminders not to make your sister feel bad. And I learned to shrink my accomplishments, to speak about them quietly or not at all, because success in my family was something that had to be rationed so it wouldn't upset the balance. And when Rachel crashed my car at 17 after taking it without permission, my father told me accidents happen and asked why I had left the keys where she could find them, and I paid the deductible myself, smiling tightly, telling myself it didn't matter, that material things were replaceable, even as a small part of me wondered why accountability always skipped over her and landed squarely on me. College made the differences impossible to ignore, because I left home on a scholarship, carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases, while Rachel stayed behind, enrolling and dropping out twice, each time greeted with reassurance and financial support, and my parents would call me late at night asking how my classes were going, but the calls always circled back to Rachel, to how hard things were for her, to how I needed to be patient, and I listened, offered advice, sent money when asked, because I thought that was what being a good daughter meant. And when I graduated and landed my first real job, working long hours in a city far from home, my parents proudly told friends about my career while privately reminding me that I was lucky, that not everyone had it as easy as I did, conveniently ignoring the loans, the overtime, the loneliness, and when Rachel needed help with rent it was assumed I would step in, and I did, again and again, wiring money without asking when it would be repaid, because asking would have made me the villain. Buying the penthouse was supposed to be a turning point, a private victory I didn't even announce until after the papers were signed, because some part of me already knew how it would be received, and when I finally told my parents, my mother hugged me tightly and said, "We always knew you'd do well," while my father nodded with approval that felt strangely possessive, and Rachel forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, joking about how nice it must be to live alone with so much space. And in the months that followed, comments started slipping in casually, about how wasteful it was for one person to live there, about how Rachel could really use a fresh start, about how family should share what it has, and every comment landed like a warning bell I chose to ignore, because acknowledging it would have meant accepting that my achievements were never seen as mine alone. They were viewed as resources, meant to be redistributed whenever Rachel needed saving. Looking back, the signs were painfully obvious, but at the time I was still operating under the old rules, the ones that told me endurance would eventually be rewarded, that if I stayed calm and reasonable, things would work themselves out, and I didn't want to believe that my parents would ever truly cross the line, because admitting that would have meant grieving the family I thought I had, and it was easier to believe that the tension was temporary, that this was just another phase, another misunderstanding I could smooth over. But the truth was that the slap didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of entitlement, years of me being framed as the solution to every problem that wasn't mine. And as I sat alone that night replaying everything, I began to see my past not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a pattern, one that explained exactly why they felt so comfortable demanding my home and punishing me when I refused. And for the first time, instead of blaming myself for not being more patient, I allowed myself to ask a harder question, one I had avoided my entire life. After that night, my refusal didn't bring silence the way I had hoped. It brought a campaign, quiet at first and then increasingly bold, as if my family believed that pressure, applied steadily enough, would eventually crack me the way it always had. And it started with messages from my mother framed as concern, asking if I was feeling better, reminding me that my father was under a lot of stress, gently suggesting we all sit down again and talk this through like adults. And when I didn't respond, the tone shifted, becoming sharper, more disappointed, more familiar. And then came the calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, asking why I was being so hard on my parents, why I couldn't just help my sister, why I was letting money come between family. And with every conversation I felt the narrative being rewritten without me, turning my boundary into cruelty and their entitlement into sacrifice. Rachel took a different approach, one that hurt more because it felt personal, showing up at my building one afternoon unannounced, crying loudly in the lobby where neighbors and the concierge could hear, telling anyone who would listen that I had kicked her out onto the street. And when I came down after security called me, she collapsed into my arms theatrically, sobbing about how lost she felt, how our parents were ashamed, how everyone thought I had abandoned her. And I remember standing there, stiff and silent, aware of the curious eyes around us, feeling my face burn with humiliation as she whispered, "Why are you doing this to me?" Like I was the one who had wronged her. And when I gently but firmly pulled away and told her she couldn't come upstairs, her expression changed instantly, the tears drying as anger replaced them, and she hissed, "You think you're better than me now, don't you?" before storming out, leaving me alone with the stares and the realization that she was willing to use public shame as a weapon. That incident opened the floodgates because soon after my parents began showing up at my workplace, my mother waiting in the lobby with red eyes and trembling hands, telling my coworkers she was worried about me, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that she just wanted to help her daughter, and the humiliation of being called down by HR to explain why my personal life was spilling into my professional one was almost worse than the slap, because it threatened the one thing I had built entirely on my own. And when I confronted my parents about it later, my father accused me of exaggerating, saying they were only trying to protect me from myself, and my mother cried and said, "We don't recognize you anymore," as if my refusal to be controlled had transformed me into a stranger. Family gatherings became ambushes, invitations extended under the guise of peace and reconciliation, only to turn into interrogations the moment I arrived, with aunts and uncles asking why I was being so cold, cousins whispering about how success had changed me, and my parents sitting silently while others did their dirty work. And the worst part was that I felt myself shrinking again, slipping back into old habits, explaining, justifying, softening my words so I wouldn't seem heartless, even as every instinct told me that nothing I said would ever be enough. And after one particularly brutal dinner where my father raised his voice and accused me of ruining Rachel's future in front of everyone, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection, seeing the bruise that had almost faded from my cheek and realizing that the emotional damage was spreading far deeper. It was in that moment, alone on the cold tile floor, that I understood how trapped I had become, because staying silent was hurting me, but speaking up only seemed to fuel their narrative, and they were counting on that confusion, on my desire to avoid conflict, on the old programming that told me peace was my responsibility. And as I sat there, listening to muffled laughter and clinking glasses on the other side of the door, I felt something inside me snap, not dramatically, not with rage, but with clarity, and I realized that if I didn't change my approach they would never stop because to them my resistance wasn't a boundary, it was a challenge. The manipulation escalated after that, moving into threats disguised as concern, with my father leaving voicemails about how I was damaging the family name, how legal action might be necessary if I continued to be unreasonable, how people in his position had options, and my mother texting late at night about her health, implying that stress from my behavior was making her sick. And every message was designed to pull me back into the role I had always played, the fixer, the absorber, the one who made things easier for everyone else. And there were moments when I almost gave in, moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable, and I found myself staring at the city from my window, wondering if peace was worth the price they were demanding. But even as the pressure mounted, I stayed silent, not because I was weak, but because something in me was shifting, because beneath the exhaustion and the doubt, a new resolve was forming. One that told me that this wasn't just about my penthouse anymore. It was about whether I would spend the rest of my life being punished for my success. And as I stopped responding altogether, letting their messages pile up unanswered, I could feel the tension building, the sense that they were growing more desperate, more reckless, and I knew with a certainty that both terrified and steadied me, that this couldn't end quietly, that something was coming, something that would force the truth into the open and leave no room for manipulation. And for the first time, instead of fearing that moment, I began to prepare for it in silence. The shift didn't announce itself with anger or speeches, it arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way dawn does when you've been awake all night, and it began with me deciding that silence would no longer mean endurance, it would mean strategy, because for the first time in my life I wasn't asking how to survive my family, I was asking how to protect myself from them, and that question changed everything. Starting with a single phone call I made on a Tuesday morning while sitting alone at my kitchen table, the city humming below, my cheek fully healed but the memory of that slap still sharp. And when the woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as an attorney specializing in property and family coercion, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Because speaking to her didn't feel like betrayal, it felt like clarity. I didn't tell anyone about that call, or the ones that followed, or the meetings I scheduled during lunch breaks where I laid out everything I had, every text message, every voicemail, every email where pressure was applied and guilt was weaponized. And as my lawyer listened without interrupting, occasionally asking me to clarify a detail, I began to see my own story reflected back to me in a different light, stripped of emotion and excuses, and framed instead as a pattern of behavior, one that had names and consequences. And when she asked me if my father had ever been physically violent before, I hesitated, then shook my head and said no, and she nodded slowly and said, "That makes this incident very significant." And for the first time I allowed myself to acknowledge that what happened wasn't just hurtful, it was wrong. At the same time I started organizing my finances with a level of precision I had never needed before, pulling records that went back years, highlighting transfers I had made to my parents and to Rachel, loans that were never repaid, expenses I had quietly absorbed because it was easier than arguing, and as I watched the numbers add up, I felt a mixture of anger and relief, because the generosity I had always framed as love now looked like obligation, and obligation, I was learning, can be documented. And I didn't do this with the intention of punishment, I did it because I needed the truth laid out clearly, in black and white, where it could no longer be denied or minimized. I also began setting boundaries in small, deliberate ways, not announcing them, just enforcing them, like blocking my parents from showing up at my building by instructing security not to let them through, or telling HR at work that any future visits from family should be treated as harassment, or refusing to answer calls that came after a certain hour. And each boundary felt awkward at first, like wearing a new pair of shoes that hadn't been broken in. But with everyone I held, I felt a little stronger, a little more certain, and I noticed that as access to me decreased, the tone of the messages I received grew sharper, more frantic, because without proximity and guilt, they had fewer tools to control me. There were moments when doubt crept in, late at night when the penthouse felt too big and too quiet, when I wondered if I was overreacting, if all of this would blow over if I just apologized and gave them what they wanted. And in those moments, I would replay the sound of my father's hand striking my face, the way no one stepped in, the way the room had waited for me to comply, and that memory grounded me, reminding me why I had started down this path in the first place. And instead of calling my mother like I would have in the past, I wrote everything down, every thought, every fear, every memory that surfaced, building a private record that belonged only to me. What I didn't do was confront them or threaten them or reveal what I was preparing, because I understood now that confrontation without leverage was just another performance, one they were skilled at controlling, and I needed to change the setting entirely, to remove the emotional fog that always settled when we were face to face, and let facts speak where I no longer could. And as the weeks passed, my lawyer helped me assemble a timeline, connecting the financial pressure, the public humiliation, the workplace interference, and the physical assault into a single coherent picture, and seeing it all together was sobering because it made it impossible to pretend this was just a misunderstanding. By the time my parents finally demanded another meeting, insisting that we resolve this like a family, I was ready in a way I had never been before, not with speeches or ultimatums, but with documentation, witnesses, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing the truth couldn't be talked over or slapped away. And when I agreed to meet them, suggesting a neutral location and including legal counsel, I could feel the balance shifting even before they realized it, because for the first time, the power in this situation didn't come from who was loudest or most emotional, it came from preparation. And as I closed my laptop after sending that email, my hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race, and I understood that whatever happened next, I would no longer be reacting, I would be choosing. The meeting took place in a downtown conference room with glass walls and neutral gray carpeting, the kind of space designed to strip emotion from conversation, and the moment I walked in with my lawyer beside me, I could feel the shift even before anyone spoke, because my parents had arrived expecting a familiar dynamic and instead were faced with something they couldn't talk over or intimidate, and my father's jaw tightened immediately while my mother's eyes flicked nervously between me and the woman carrying my file, and Rachel sat beside them stiffly, arms crossed, clearly unsettled by the formality, and as we took our seats, my father tried to regain control by clearing his throat and saying, "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." But his voice lacked the authority it once carried because this time, he wasn't standing in my living room, and he wasn't speaking without consequence. The attorney my parents had brought began first, outlining what he called a reasonable family solution, carefully avoiding words like demand or coercion, describing how transferring the penthouse to Rachel would restore harmony. And as he spoke, my parents nodded along, confident, while Rachel stared at the table, and I listened without interrupting, hands folded calmly, because this wasn't the moment to argue, it was the moment to let the truth surface. And when he finally finished and looked at my lawyer expecting negotiation, she didn't respond immediately, she simply slid a thick folder across the table and said, "Before we discuss any proposals, there are some misconceptions we need to clear up." And as the other attorney opened it, the room grew quiet in a way that felt heavy and irreversible. He began reading, his expression shifting subtly with each page, and soon he was asking questions, directed not at me but at my parents, about their belief that they had any ownership claim over my property. And when my father scoffed and said, "We're her parents," the attorney looked up and replied calmly, "That doesn't create a legal interest." And then he explained slowly and clearly that the penthouse was solely in my name, purchased with my funds, and that any attempt to force or intimidate me into transferring it could constitute coercion. And I watched my mother's face drain of color as the words sank in, watched Rachel's foot begin to tap nervously beneath the table, and felt a strange stillness settle inside me, because this was the first time anyone outside the family had named what was happening without excuses. Then my lawyer spoke again, outlining the documented pattern of pressure, the repeated unwanted appearances at my workplace and home, the messages implying reputational damage, the financial transfers I had made over the years under expectation rather than agreement, and finally, she addressed the incident my parents had worked so hard to minimize, stating plainly that my father had struck me during a dispute over property, and the word assault hung in the air like a dropped object no one wanted to pick up, and my father reacted instantly, raising his voice and calling it an exaggeration, a moment taken out of context, but the conference room didn't respond the way my living room had. No one flinched or backed down, and when the attorney across the table asked if there were witnesses or documentation, my lawyer calmly referenced medical records and contemporaneous messages that supported my account, and for the first time my father fell silent. Rachel finally spoke then, her voice tight and defensive, saying she never asked for things to go this far, that she just needed help, and something in me softened for a moment, not enough to change my position, but enough to see her clearly, because even now, faced with consequences, she framed herself as the victim of circumstances rather than a participant in them. And when my lawyer responded that help was offered repeatedly and declined in favor of entitlement, Rachel looked at me with something like disbelief, as if it had never occurred to her that there were limits to what she could take, and my mother started crying quietly, murmuring that this wasn't how families were supposed to work, and the irony of that statement settled over the room, heavy and unmistakable. The meeting ended abruptly after the attorneys conferred privately, with my parents being advised firmly to cease all attempts to contact or pressure me regarding the property, and to direct any further communication through legal channels. And as we stood to leave, my father looked at me, really looked at me, not with anger this time but with something closer to confusion, like he was seeing a version of me he didn't recognize, one who wouldn't fold, and I met his gaze steadily, not triumphant, not vengeful, just resolved. And when we walked out into the hallway, the glass doors closing behind us, my lawyer turned to me and said quietly, "You did exactly what you needed to do." And as those words settled in, I felt the power dynamic finally decisively flip, not because I had taken something from them, but because I had stopped letting them take from me. In the weeks after that meeting, the noise slowly faded, not all at once but in stages, like a storm moving farther out to sea, and the first thing that surprised me was how quiet my phone became. No late-night messages from my mother hinting at illness, no voicemails from my father layered with authority and disappointment, no sudden appearances meant to corner me into compliance, because once consequences were clearly outlined, their urgency dissolved into distance, and that distance, instead of feeling like loss, felt like relief settling into my bones for the first time in my life. The penthouse remained exactly as it was, sunlight spilling across hardwood floors, city lights blinking on at dusk, and for the first time since I bought it, the space felt wholly mine, not something I had to defend or justify, and I began to notice how much of my energy had always been spent anticipating conflict, preparing explanations, bracing for disappointment, and without that constant tension my days felt lighter, more deliberate, as if I had finally stepped out of a role I was never meant to play. Rachel reached out once, weeks later, not with an apology but with a short message saying she hoped we could eventually move past this, and I read it carefully, recognizing the familiar pattern, the attempt to skip accountability and land directly on forgiveness, and instead of responding out of habit, I took my time, considering what I actually wanted, and what I wanted wasn't distance out of spite or reconciliation out of guilt, it was honesty, so I replied calmly, telling her I wished her well but that any relationship going forward would require respect for my boundaries and ownership of her choices, and when she didn't respond I felt no urge to chase the conversation, because for once silence didn't feel like punishment, it felt like clarity. My parents never apologized, not for the slap, not for the pressure, not for the years of favoritism that led us there, and oddly enough that stopped hurting once I accepted it, because I realized that waiting for an apology had kept me tethered to the hope that they would one day see me the way I deserved, and letting go of that hope allowed me to grieve properly not just the conflict, but the family dynamic I had spent decades trying to fix. And grief, I learned, doesn't always come with tears, sometimes it comes with a steady resolve to stop reopening old wounds. Professionally, the chaos they tried to inject into my life never materialized again, and the support I received from colleagues who quietly noticed my composure through it all reinforced something important, that my value had never been dependent on my family's approval, and as months passed, I invested more of myself into work I enjoyed, friendships that felt mutual, routines that didn't revolve around managing someone else's emotions, and the penthouse became a place of restoration rather than defense, a home where I could exhale fully, knowing no one would demand pieces of it as proof of love. Sometimes, late at night, I would think back to that first moment, my father's hand striking my face, my mother's silence, my sister's expectation, and instead of anger, I felt something closer to understanding, not understanding that excused their behavior, but understanding that explained it, because entitlement thrives where boundaries are never enforced, and I had spent years teaching them unintentionally that mine were flexible. And while that realization stung, it also empowered me, because it meant the ending of this story wasn't written by them, it was written by the moment I finally said no and meant it. I didn't win by humiliating anyone or by taking revenge, I won by reclaiming authorship over my own life, by choosing peace that didn't require self-erasure, by understanding that strength isn't measured by how much you can endure for others, but by how well you protect yourself when endurance becomes exploitation. And if there is justice here, it's not dramatic or loud, it's quiet and steady. It's waking up each day without dread. It's walking through my home without feeling like it's on loan. It's knowing that my worth was never tied to how much I gave away. I am still a daughter, but I am no longer a sacrifice, and that distinction has changed everything because now when I look at the city from my window, I don't see a prize I have to defend. I see a life I built intentionally, brick by brick, boundary by boundary. And for the first time, I don't wonder what would happen if I gave in, because I already know what happens when I don't. I keep my dignity, my safety, and my sense of self, and that is something no one gets to take from me again. If you enjoy powerful family drama stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more.